There are games that hook you in from the very moment you spawn, throwing flashing bright lights, high-octane cutscenes, satisfying combat, and cinematic music from frame 1. It launches you right in the middle of a high adrenaline space. You think to yourself, oh yeah, I'm in for a ride. Then there are games that start with silence. They whisper their potential to you, luring you closer. They demand patience and faith, but in exchange, they promise something deeper and more profound than an explosion of stimulation. They promise a life-changing experience, one that is hard to love at times, but ultimately impossible to hate. That's what I found waiting for me in the quiet, decrepit cell at the start of Dark Souls 1, a game that initially I avoided journeying to. You see, I started gaming in the year 2024. My first game was Breath of the Wild, then Elden Ring, Dark Souls 3, and a little bit of Dark Souls 2, with some other Souls-like sprinkled on the side. When I first played Elden Ring, I was starstruck by the lands between and From Software's game design. This introduction to the Souls genre was a double-edged sword. Elden Ring was gorgeous, accessible, and low friction for me. It had set expectations of quality of life features and graphics that made it harder to play older titles, as every game before Elden Ring felt like a step down, a lesser version of what was already the peak of FromSoft's repertoire. It was more than just stylistic differences like dungeons versus open world format. I was fine with that and found that I actually preferred the more linear experiences. The real problem was that every generational leap came with a drop in quality of life features, graphics, and gameplay refinement. There were obvious decisions and technical limitations that were these games made today simply wouldn't exist. At the outset, with Dark Souls 3, these differences weren't too noticeable. But as I kept moving backwards, the gaps compounded. All of this felt like it was building up to the final boss of classic Souls-like Dark Souls 1. It has been 15 years since the release of Dark Souls 1 in 2011. For many people, this release date evokes warm and positive feelings of nostalgia. The wonder and excitement of playing Dark Souls for the first time, or perhaps all of the good and the bad games you've played since. For me, this number evoked a sense of aversion. I asked my friends about the game and looked into what various critics and members of the community had to say, and the responses were mixed. Some call it a timeless masterpiece and a life-changing experience. Others say that the game controls feel sluggish, clunky, and unrefined, or that the boss designs were too simplistic, making the game feel tedious. Both sides came at it from different perspectives. To me, it felt similar to the discourse on black and white media or radio dramas. There are masterpieces that were revolutionary at the time that they were made, but wouldn't be judged the same way today. They were considered amazing because they were first, but they weren't the best within their medium. These are the classic bestseller games that have quote-unquote aged poorly. Other works of art transcend the limitations of their medium and are almost ageless in nature. The average viewer can't tell what year Starry Night was made in. There's no old textures or visual artifacts that give away the release date on Picasso's Guernica. There's no glitchy rendering on Michelangelo's sculpture of David that reveals how old the chisel was. There are many games like this, like Undertale, Minecraft, or Portal 2. As a new gamer, I had no clue whether these games were made a year ago or 15 years ago. I couldn't tell you. What about Dark Souls? Before all of this, I had over 1,000 hours in Night Rain, almost 500 in Elden Ring, 300 in Dark Souls 3, and 100 in Lies of P. But whenever I tried playing games from the same time period as Dark Souls, I struggled to get into them because of their age and clunkiness. The textures felt like cardboard, and the frames sometimes felt like a slideshow. In the end, though, there's no substitute for direct experience. The only way for me to truly decide is to try it out myself. In this video, I'm going to take you with me on a journey through my Dark Souls experience. I want to take you along to each area, charting the same path I took on my first playthrough, noting important gameplay mechanics and design choices and experiences as they come up. This journey is going to be a long one, so I've made sure to leave signposts along the way with timestamps in the description. At the end, I'll take a holistic view of the game and my time with it from the perspective of a freshly minted gamer. My goal is to find my own answer to the big question: does Dark Souls still hold up over a decade later? Before we begin, I want to point out that this wasn't a 100% blind playthrough. I had tips from my community from many areas on late night calls on my server, and I also believe in the power of Google, and you'll hear me describe when I had to look up certain things to avoid getting stuck or missing out on content. All of that served to enhance my experience for the better, and I wouldn't change it one bit, but I do think it's good context to have going into this. I also need to say how extremely grateful I am to my patrons and the community members of my Discord. This was my first time taking on such a huge video project, and it genuinely frightened me, especially given the infamy and the difficulty of the game. But just like the players' messages littered across Dark Souls, the support from my patrons and community pushed me to see this journey through to the end. Without it, this video would have gone hollow, doomed to never see the light of day. You all have yourselves to thank for this video as much as me. So thank you, truly. Without further ado, let's begin. I awoke alone in a grimy cell in the Undead Asylum. A mysterious knight dropped the key to escape this hopeless place. It was very clear to me from frame 1 that Lordran was desolate, coated with hopelessness and ugliness. I suppose it didn't help that I picked up my weapons and learned the controls to the sound of stomping footsteps of the Asylum demon, pacing menacingly behind bars. I knew immediately that this was the gatekeeper to my escape, and that thought never left my mind as I made my way through the defenseless hollows sprinkled throughout the asylum. About 2 minutes later, I was faced with this demon. This was a very interesting encounter. Though you can fight him here, the broken sword did so little damage that I'd have to chip away at his health with extreme precision and patience. However, I noticed there was a side gate in the boss arena. I escaped into it, and the door shut automatically behind me. This mechanic showed me 2 things. 1, if a boss is too hard, I might be missing either levels or the right equipment. And 2, there can be alternative paths to progress. These 2 principles prepared me for the rest of the game and set the stage for many complex encounters after this. The Asylum introduced me to the game's combat and environmental mechanics like item drops, bonfires, opening doors, and traps. One of these traps, a rolling boulder, led me to a fateful encounter. I discovered a knight hiding behind the wall, the same one who dropped me the key at the start of the game, Oscar. Oscar gave me my Estus flask, the vital lifeline to heals I knew I'd be using throughout the game. He also shared a prophecy with me that the chosen undead should go and ring the bells of awakening. From that point on, I had my first objective. After a bit more exploration, I made my way back to the Asylum demon. This time around, the fight went by so much faster and smoother. The platform leading down to the boss arena introduced me to the plunge attack, an interesting mechanic that reminds me of the Archdragon in DS3. I wondered if this game was where that plunge attack came from. Once I defeated the demon, I made my way out and hitched a ride on an enormous crow to the next destination. The crow dropped me at a place called the Firelink Shrine, the iconic hub area for Dark Souls 1. When I got there, I began to realize that this game wouldn't have a clear, linear path for me to follow. Even though I had previously played Elden Ring, a true open-world game, Dark Souls 1 confused me way more at the beginning. I had no idea where to go next. I walked around the structure within the Firelink Shrine. The various nooks and crannies didn't seem to clearly indicate a specific path, and I was very concerned with getting it right, so to speak. I didn't want to make this game even harder for myself by accidentally picking the wrong direction to go. I'm also going to confess here that I am and have always been a bit of a yap hater. I generally dislike video games giving me long dialogues, cutscenes, lore dumps, and quest directions. So very much to my own demise, I didn't bother speaking to the crestfallen knight that is literally sitting 2 feet away from the shrine bonfire. It took me walking around in circles for a good 10 minutes before I realized I needed some NPC hand-holding after all. That's when I finally spoke to the warrior and learned more details about my mission to ring the 2 bells. What he told me was simple. There's a bell up above and one way down below. To decide which direction to head in first, I follow the golden rule of allowing the game design to tell me where to head next, namely by gauging how fast I would die in a certain direction. After getting ganked on by cemetery skeletons and intangible ghosts of New Londo Ruins, I figured out, hey, maybe don't go that way. Instead, I stumbled my way into the Undead Burg. At this point in the game, I started to notice how slow Dark Souls 1 seemed compared to other titles like Elden Ring. My starting gear and equip load technically gives me a medium roll, but a Dark Souls 1 medium roll felt like an Elden Ring fat roll to me. The movement felt slow and sluggish, like playing with an input delay. Once I entered the Undead Burg, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to take off as much armor as possible so I could get a light roll. Thankfully, the hollows and archer enemies here all seemed to move in a linear, similar fashion. Even though I still felt slower than usual, I felt comfortable fighting the enemies. Unfortunately, they also had a very long aggro range, with each variation of hollows chasing me to what felt like the ends of the earth. I learned very quickly that the safest way to move forward was to move slowly and kill everything in my way to avoid getting ganked on in dead ends. The aesthetics of the Undead Burg was rather plain for me, with no special biome features or architectural designs. While this seemed a little boring at first, I actually appreciated the simplicity as I made my way through. This area started to introduce more enemy variety. The simple layout allowed me to stay focused on the pace of combat and getting comfortable with different attack patterns. This was also where I first encountered the Taurus demon. Like the Asylum demon, the Taurus demon paces around in a similar pattern. It turned out that the plunge attack I learned earlier would come in handy here. Once I entered the arena, I immediately saw archers on top of an adjacent tower. I didn't want to get sniped throughout my fight, so naturally, I climbed up the ladder to kill them. After I killed the archers, I looked down at the Taurus demon staring up at me. A light bulb went off. It clicked for me then that it was an opportunity for a plunge attack. In retrospect, moments like these were some of my favorite. Times where the game taught me something important and tested me later, all without telling me. It felt like I discovered these things on my own. That magical experience wouldn't have happened if a pop-up showed up saying, "Press X to plunge now." After I caught on to this trick, the Taurus demon fight went by quickly. I rinsed and repeated this method a few times and he was dead. I have to admit, I did not expect fights with these kinds of exploits in Dark Souls. So far, the only 2 boss encounters both had the same vulnerability to plunge attacks. I personally didn't mind it, as boss encounters had never really been a main focus of experience for me in these games. But this coincidence left me wondering if future boss fights would have their own gimmicks or exploits. With the Taurus demon dead, I made my way to the Undead Parish. There are 2 main bonfires in the Undead Parish. One past the dragon on the Great Bridge, and the other is where you'll also find the blacksmith Andre, the NPC who upgrades your weapons. His location is one of the most intriguing in the entire game. Above him, where I met a resting Siegmeyer, is a locked gate that will later lead to an area called Sense Fortress, and even further up is the pathway to the rest of Undead Parish. Directly beneath him, there's a gigantic Titanite demon just waiting to square up on you. So to summarize, this guy is sandwiched between 2 important areas on top of him and a boss fight right underneath him. I have no idea how he found himself here or why he's just out here chilling with a crazed demon just a few feet away from him, but it did make for a very strong first impression. At first, I tried fighting the Titanite demon. After getting zapped to death multiple times though, I quickly changed my mind on that. Instead, I ran past him to a pathway that led even deeper into the world. I saw the Darkroot Garden there and made sure to take note of it. I wanted to stick to my goals of ringing the bells first, and this didn't seem like the path, so I decided to come back around later. I turned back around and upwards, entering the Undead Parish yet again. As I moved through the area, I did my best to scrape all the loot in sight. I'm always apprehensive about missing important items, so I've developed a habit of picking up anything that isn't nailed to the floor. As I kept exploring, I eventually picked up an item called Basement Key. Item description reads, opens the narrow passage leading below at the far face of the Great Bridge in the Undead Burg. I assumed this would unlock an area later on. For now though, I remained focused on progressing through the area and getting to the Bell of Awakening, so I made a mental note of it and pressed on. Next, I made my way into a nearby building. Inside, I discovered the iconic elevator ride down to the Firelink Shrine. I think on the ride down to the Firelink Shrine, something changed in my brain chemistry in the way I related to this game. My existence as an undead in Lordran felt real and solid in that moment. Lordran transformed from a game environment to an aged world. It reminded me of what it felt like to discover Siolfa River for the first time in Elden Ring. These moments of discovery in Souls games have a magic to them I've yet to experience elsewhere. This elevator ride was the moment that Dark Souls began to embody that same magic I've come to expect from the series. It was reinforced, I think, by the key that I'd found moments earlier. Souls games always seem to sprinkle these subtle pieces and essential tools for what's to come long before you need them. It makes the world feel lived in and connected with transitions that feel natural rather than sudden. With the elevator unlocked, I returned to the Undead Parish. Inside, I got hit with yet another big dramatic gang squad of hollows. I died more than a few times here. Each time I came back, I tried to just run past the hollows and avoid them entirely. After a few tries, I made it to the rooftop. It was totally RNG, but hey, I made it. On the roof, I came face to face with the next boss fight, the Bell Gargoyles. I believe this fight might be the OG gank fight that later turned into the Valiant Gargoyles in Elden Ring, except this fight was actually good. In Elden Ring, the Valiant Gargoyles you find in the underground section of Siolfa River are a dual boss, with the second gargoyle spawning when the first one is at half health, just like the case in Dark Souls 1. However, unlike Dark Souls 1, the Valiant Gargoyles in Elden Ring are seemingly unaware of each other, acting aggressively and leaving me very little time to react or find the rhythm to the fight. I felt frustrated every time I was defeated. With this fight though, I actually had a lot of fun. I think it comes down to the simplicity of each gargoyle's moveset and the way the two bosses synchronize with each other. See, the arena is relatively small compared to the size of the bosses. However, its uneven surface provides lots of space for cover and kite maneuvers, despite the small size. During the fight, I enjoyed managing aggro and isolating a gargoyle to attack. Their attack patterns played off of each other. They didn't jump down my throat at the same time. They had a rhythm that created both opportunities for me to strike and dangerous punishing combos to avoid. It felt tough, but fair. The Valiant Gargoyles made me feel desperate and frustrated, like I was getting jumped in an alleyway by giant statues. On the other hand, the Bell Gargoyles felt like a careful duel, a dance where mistakes were lethal and playing to the rhythm was rewarded. After a few tries, I took down the gargoyles. Now I could achieve the first half of my objective, set all the way back in the asylum. I rang the first bell of awakening. This achievement didn't come with a sense of immediate progression though. After ringing, I meandered up and down around the bell tower for longer than I'd like to admit. Eventually, I realized that this tower was a dead end. From a knowledge perspective, I really should have known that I needed to go back the way I came, because the game tells you clearly that at the Firelink Shrine. There's a bell above and a bell below. From a design perspective, the path didn't feel intuitive. Later on though, I discovered one of the ways the game tries to tell you that you've hit a dead end. If a boss drops a homeward bone, an item that teleports you back to the last bonfire rested at, it usually means it's time to head back. Alas, this revelation only came much later in my playthrough. This time, I did a painstaking march back the way I came. I sat at Andre's bonfire and wondered where I should go next. I remember the basement key I picked up earlier in the area. The key opened up a door on the far end of the Great Bridge, and the stairs led me to the lower Undead Burg. To be honest, I debated back and forth whether or not this area served an actual purpose in gameplay progression. For the most part, the lower Undead Burg is rather unremarkable. As far as I could tell, this area was filled with traps and ambushes, complete with annoying enemies that deal bleed status. In retrospect, I suppose it served as a training ground for the hell that was about to come after. In essence, this area provided two shortcuts that connect Undead Burg and the Firelink Shrine. At the end of this area, I found myself facing the Capper Demon. The Capper Demon fight might be the only boss in all Souls games that I can say with 100% certainty that I absolutely despise. Well, I didn't know there would be worse coming down the line. And mind you, I don't think I have really ever crashed out at a boss fight, as with most of them I just think to myself that I might have a skill issue, and just need to practice against boss movesets some more. With the Capper Demon, I was only left with frustration. For the first 5 to 10 tries, I died almost the moment I walked through the fog. The dogs came rushing at me while I tried to dodge, and before I knew it, I was dead. After a while, I learned to try and run past the dogs and go up and down the stairs to try and plunge attack the demon. I succeeded in the end after quite a few rinse and repeats to get it just right. But to be completely honest, it was mostly luck that I didn't get stomped the second I walked through the fog. The sense of relief rather than triumph felt like a red flag, as the challenge didn't feel like a test of strength, but a test of luck that felt beyond my control. With the Capper Demon dead, I received the key to the depths. The depths is as it sounds, a deep, intricate sewer system underground. It was reminiscent of the subterranean shunning ground from Elden Ring, though I suppose it should be the other way around. The enemy types here are a medley of the most annoying ones. Rats, basilisks, torch hollows, and the one magic guy that dances in the funniest way. On my first playthrough of DS1, I walked into the room with the basilisks and immediately got cursed. This is an interesting mechanic, as curse can only be caused by the basilisks found both in the depth and in the Great Hollow, as well as the Scalas I would encounter later. When cursed, the player's HP pool will be reduced by 50%, and this health will not recover until a purging stone is used. Not even a bonfire visit will save you. I personally dislike this mechanic. Without prior knowledge of it, you're forced to walk all the way back to the undead merchant in the sewer in Undead Burg. Or you can try to push through a difficult area at half health. I imagine this mechanic is deployed here as a way to increase the pressure of being underground and being further away from Firelink. Although the curse status did frustrate me, I also developed a twisted appreciation for it. It felt like a deliberate attempt to force the player into a place of fear and isolation. I didn't enjoy it mechanically, but I respected how the devs were trying to pull it off. Luckily, thanks to my habit of buying at least one consumable of each type, I had a purging stone that helped me remove the curse. For the recording of this video, I somehow managed to avoid them altogether. Walking through areas with curse-afflicting enemies is not mandatory, therefore I think the extreme consequences are fair play. After traversing through the sewer system and getting lost a few times, I managed to find the Gaping Dragon, the area boss. This fight is a humorous experience for me. This is not the first time I fought the Gaping Dragon. Night Rain's implementation of the Gaping Dragon gave me tons and tons of experience fighting this boss. Or so I thought. I walked into the boss arena with a +5 scimitar, thinking I would erase the dragon in a few hits. What I had neglected to consider was how slow my character was in Dark Souls. The Gaping Dragon was a piece of cake in Night Rain because our characters have special skills, dodges, and a magical button called Surge Sprint. The devs tried to make the Gaping Dragon more difficult by giving it more poison to spew out, but its movesets still could not catch up to Night Rain's combat speed. In Dark Souls 1, however, my character was just as slow. My rows were heavy and four-directional, and it consumed a lot of stamina for me to run and catch up to the Gaping Dragon. My camera was also a lot more difficult to navigate. Despite everything I just described, the Gaping Dragon wasn't all too bad. He was harder than the Night Rain variant, but still easier than many of the other bosses in DS1, so with him down, I received the key to Blighttown. Of the few things I had heard about Dark Souls prior to playing, Blighttown was the most infamous of them all. It is renowned for being dark and full of disgusting enemies and traps. I mean, the entrance to Blighttown is literally a giant black hole in the ground. Right off the bat, Blighttown's sheer vertical layout fascinated me. The entire area is constructed of narrow pathways and ladders that connect them. Where the Undead Parish felt like a masterclass in interconnectivity, Blighttown's layout felt like a brilliant example of a self-contained structure. As I descended the ladders of various platforms, enemies like barbarians, these gnarly hollow guys, and tiny red fire-spewing dogs were all coming at me from different angles. The enemies were hard-hitting, yes, but the thing that made them extra annoying was their aggro range. Enemies in Blighttown tend to be spread along the edges of platforms, which means their vision spans across multiple axes. More often than not, multiple enemies aggro simultaneously, and given the dark atmosphere, they saw me before I could see them. They would then all funnel through one ladder, and before I knew it, I was surrounded by 5 of them at the same time. Since the beginning, the game had been rewarding me for taking things slow to avoid ganking and traps. Blighttown is where this caution is 100% warranted. After dying one too many times to some random enemy sneaking up on me as I was trying to run past them, I killed literally anything that moved, one at a time. It took me way more time, but it was the safest way for me to ensure progress forward. After leaving the last bonfire in the depths, I ventured down Blighttown, taking many twists and turns, weaving in and out of scaffolding, and the only thing I could think of was, please bring me to a bonfire. Unfortunately for me, there are a total of 2 bonfires in this area. 2. The first bonfire came as a surprise halfway down the structure, tucked away on a platform. Once I rested at the bonfire and leveled up with all the souls I collected on the way down, I dove into the depths of the swamp. This next section of Blighttown gave me a hard time. The various platforms were riddled with hollows and barbarians, each one willing to chase me to the ends of the earth. To add insult to injury, it was very easy to get lost and end up surrounded by a gank squad. By some miracle, I made it past the hole in the structure to the other side. When I saw the swamp down below, I got so excited. I saw a glimmer of hope in a dire place. In terms of progression, I kind of was, quite literally. I think the lack of bonfires in Blighttown really served to emphasize the danger of this world. I could vaguely see the skybox when I looked up, and I could not believe that such a dark place was technically all open air. As I made my way down to the swamp, I was quite literally praying that I didn't die by accident. I had absolutely no certainty that I would be able to make it back here from the spawn. Eventually, I arrived at the bottom of the swamp. I followed the messages left by other players, and I finally found the second bonfire of this area. From this bonfire, I did 2 things. 1, I made my way to Queelagg, ringing my second bell of awakening, and 2, I went up the watermill to open up the passage back to Firelink Shrine. I stumbled my way across the pond, thinking I needed to go up the watermill structure to get to where I needed to go next. After some platforming and many deaths to these evil bloat dark guys and fire dogs, I finally made it all the way out of this hellhole that was Blighttown. The key I picked up along the way opened up a door across the bridge in the Valley of Drakes, an interesting hub area all on its own. More on that later. Before I knew it, I was back at the Firelink shrine. I was ecstatic, thinking I could rest at the bonfire and get a whole 10 flasks since this was a kindled bonfire. I climbed up the stairs from New Londo Ruins and found out that somehow my firekeeper vanished. Without her, the bonfire wouldn't work, so instead of my 10 flasks, I was left with her things and a black-eyed orb. It was a very sad breakup. With my faint ray of hope firmly extinguished, I went back the way I came, 5 flasks lighter than intended, and on a course back to the horrors of Blighttown. Back in Blighttown, I discovered a hole in the wall in the webbed area of the swamp. I entered the hole and found the area boss waiting for me inside, Queelagg. She stood in the way of the second bell of awakening, making her defeat necessary for finally completing that first objective given to me back in the Firelink shrine. Queelagg's boss fight ranks among my favorite bosses in Dark Souls. Her humanoid half strikes at the player with sweeping and poking attacks. Meanwhile, her lower spider half spews lava and explosive attacks at regular intervals. I loved how these two halves work in tandem with each other to create a challenging fight. See, the attacks from her humanoid half are simple and telegraphed well in advance. They're not hard to dodge. However, the lava attacks create persistent environmental hazards, restricting the space you can move in. A thoughtless dodge will roll you away from the attack and right into a pit of lava. For Queelagg, the question isn't when to dodge, but rather where you're going to dodge. Overall, I loved the boss fight and managed to beat her in a few tries. With the fight complete, I took a quick walk out of her arena and up to the second bell of awakening. Once I pulled the lever to ring the bell, a cutscene appeared. It revealed that the bells had awoken a sleeping giant, who then opened a gate. I immediately recognized the gate as the same one I encountered near Andre's bonfire. I now knew where to go next. I made my way up the watermill and hurried over to the gate, taking me into the infamous Sense Fortress. Despite Blighttown's reputation, I found Sense Fortress to be much worse, specifically in terms of how hostile and dense with enemies the space is. Sense Fortress made it very clear that it'll throw whatever obstacles it can at me, every chance it gets. As soon as I walked through the gates, I stepped on a trap and aggroed 2 man serpents, a new and unique enemy type in this area. I escaped them by the skin of my teeth, only to immediately die to the swinging axes right inside. This first encounter gave me a preview for how I'd be spending the next few hours. I continued to die over and over again to various traps, fighting for every inch of progress on my way to the bonfire. However, as much as I hated the rinse and repeat of many of my efforts to progress, I did find the level design to be intricate and fascinating. Sense Fortress, according to Andre of Astora, is an old proving ground built by the ancient gods, as the only gateway leading to Anor Londo, hence the swinging axes and death traps. Maybe it was just Stockholm Syndrome, but I appreciated the narrative significance of this. It made the deaths feel like a purposeful part of my journey instead of an arbitrary slaughterhouse. The complicated layout also hid plenty of rewards alongside the traps. The first mimic chest I encountered dropped the lightning spear, a weapon that was so good it carried me for the rest of my game. Moments like this give me an appreciation for the intricacy in Dark Souls maps, where optional activities, secrets, and dangers are hidden throughout the game. As I fought my way through the jungle of traps, I also learned just what a godsend the online messages were. They somehow always managed to help me out when I was most desperate, pointing out traps, illusory walls, and mimic chests. With the help of these messages, I finally made it to the rooftop and the hidden bonfire. Once again, the bonfire's location was revealed to me by a helpful message left by another player. At the top of Fortress, I found the area boss, the Iron Golem. The Iron Golem has an interesting setup. Nearby the main arena, there's a separate giant throwing boulders at you while you fight. To prevent the rain of boulders, you need to take him out before the fight. This setup deepened my sense of immersion as I realized these were the same boulders being thrown at me throughout my journey on the rooftop. The Iron Golem itself was pretty standard as far as boss fights go. It was painless and very smooth, given that there were not really much flair besides just being careful not to fall off the arena. After taking out the golem, a new cutscene appeared. Flying creatures descended from the sky, whisking me away from the Sense Fortress and depositing me at my long-awaited destination, Anor Londo. Structurally speaking, Anor Londo marks the midpoint of Dark Souls. In many ways, Anor Londo is the climax for this first act of the journey, and it shows. This was the first area outside of the tutorial that required a loading screen for me to enter. Up until this point, area progression had always been seamless, with an interconnectedness that felt like an open world. I'd opened lock gates, ascended elevators, climbed ladders, and done all sorts of things to get from place to place without facing a single loading screen. This sudden transition away from any familiarity to a brand new place marked a turning point. I was excited to see what came next and just knew it would be something special. The arrival to Anor Londo was a religious experience for me. The landing of this flight overlooked the entirety of what might be one of the most beautiful video game areas I have ever seen. I remain in awe of its scale and intricate detail, astonished by the solemn stillness and almost sterile nature of the environment. There are larger-than-life guardians, elaborate architecture, and infinite hallways that lead to various rooms and artifacts of a kingdom past. It is truly a marvel to behold. A large part of the emotional impact came from Anor Londo's sheer contrast against everything I had been through up to this point. The darkness and hopelessness of the depths and Blighttown, the ever-accumulating frustration inside Sense Fortress. Everything seemed to be worth it now that I am under the sunlight and in Anor Londo. Throughout this journey, fear and desperation had dominated my gameplay. I had measured every enemy encounter against the value of my remaining resources. If I fight this, will I have enough flasks and consumables to get to the next bonfire? The gap between checkpoints created a constant background stress. I knew I had missed out on certain items and corners of the games because of my sheer fixation of moving from bonfire to bonfire. I feared dying halfway through a miserable section of the game and having to redo it again and again. Somehow, that pressure evaporated in Anor Londo. Sure, there were sections of this area, like the ceiling rafters, that felt annoying to repeat, but the interesting enemy types and intricate environmental design kept me engaged the whole time. It gave me a reason to let go of the frustration of defeat and the fear of the walk back. It allowed me to just be in the moment. Here, I encountered new enemy types, most notably the Painting Guardians and Silver Knights, both of which can be parried. Parrying in this game also felt very intuitive to me. Enemy attacks were cleanly telegraphed, down to the very last second where their weapon would connect to my shield. In the later titles, people had always told me that certain enemies were a cakewalk if I knew how to parry, like the Crucible Knights in Elden Ring and Night Rain. That never seemed to work out for me the few times I tried, as their movesets came out way too fast for me to press the parry button in time. This time around, I got to experience the satisfaction of a clean, perfect parry. The core of Anor Londo's layout rests with a giant rotating staircase in the middle that connects to all the important sub-areas. The first floor where the giant painting is, the entrance to Anor Londo, the connected structures where the boss arena is, as well as a secret area for Gwendolyn. I started by working my way through the first floor. There, I fought against Painting Guardians on ceiling beams. I have to say, as fun as it was to see these new enemy designs, it seemed a little counterintuitive for them to be all hanging around the ceiling. I thought the whole point was for me to stealth my way into the building via the broken window. But when I found all the guardians waiting for me there, it felt unnatural, like the game was telling me, hey, I knew you'd come this way. Anyways, immersion breaking mechanics aside, I really enjoyed how different parts of Anor Londo led way to the next. The highlight of my experience here has got to be going through each individual room of the castle, fighting the Silver Knights that are left to protect it, and observing the artifacts of a kingdom past. It was the first time that I truly felt a sense of awe for the narrative details hidden in the game's design. I love the way it seamlessly integrated into the story of Lordran, as well as the chilling, contemplative effect that intentional silence can provoke. Anor Londo is so quiet and still. Every knight who is stationed here seemed to be locked in time, forgetting what it is they need to protect, but waiting patiently to do their job to protect it from intruders. Going through here really did make me feel like a trespasser, someone who wasn't meant to be here, violating the still peace that remained in this place. By the time I found myself at the boss arena, I almost felt guilty to continue. Within the boss arena, I faced the formidable Ornstein and Smo, and was rightfully intimidated by their posture and might. Mechanically, I could see this as the OG duo boss fight that later turned into Elden Ring bosses like the Godskin duo, except Ornstein and Smo felt steady in pacing and fair to my movements. In my attempts to beat this boss, I varied who I would kill first in the first phase, and got to see both of the cutscenes in the transition to the second phase. I loved this detail, as the varying cutscenes made the fight feel more real, and that the two bosses really were working together. The fact that you end up with different boss souls depending on who you kill last is also a unique feature. I called in a friend to help, and together we had a blast fighting this boss. With Ornstein and Smo defeated, I was awarded with the Lord Vessel by Guinevere that finally unlocked fast travel. This left me with mixed feelings. On one hand, I was relieved to finally be free from the curse of the constant backtracking. On the other hand, I knew I was going to miss walking every inch of Lordran, going from place to place. The lack of fast travel had made my Dark Souls journey more intimate, trekking through different terrains and overcoming different obstacles along the way. After securing the Lord Vessel, I proceeded to kill Guinevere. My one arrow attack instantly killed her. And don't ask me why I killed her, you gotta let your intrusive thoughts win from time to time. Once I killed her, a voice began to speak. That voice revealed that the Anor Londo I'd seen up until this point was all just a facade. This was by far my favorite mechanic of the entire game. The voice of Gwendolyn revealed that he was the one who was secretly ruling Anor Londo under the beloved image of his sister Guinevere, but in the end, stole a facade. From a lore perspective, this deception by Gwendolyn added so much depth to the sterility I had experienced up to this point, to think back and realize that the amazing sunlight was all fake. From a gameplay perspective, it felt like beating the boss had rewarded me with even more content. It didn't take me long to find Gwendolyn, the prince who is behind this facade, and his boss fight is hands down one of the most memorable of the Dark Souls boss roster. The fight itself is not mechanically challenging at all, as Gwendolyn only has 3 distinct range moves, and the moment you run across the ever-stretching hallway to actually reach him, he is nothing but a sitting duck. But the beauty of this fight lies in the experience of the rhythm of running and hiding, all while the most beautiful and fitting music sets the harrowing tone of this fight. I loved every minute of it, and I most definitely thanked myself for immediately killing Guinevere. Sorry not sorry. With the boss fight over, I completed my task of getting the Firekeeper's soul back. Before heading off to the next area though, I decided to take a little detour. Thanks to some helpful tips from a friend, I knew that there would be a path to an optional area called the Painted World. Its location is, well, you guessed it, the giant painting from earlier in Anor Londo. But before I could enter the painted world, I needed to make a quick trip down memory lane, all the way back to where this journey started. Entry into the painted world requires an object called the Peculiar Doll. You can only get this item by returning to the Undead Asylum after having beaten it. The Undead Asylum shifts upon returning with new enemies. In a sense, the painted world is actually 2 optional areas in disguise because of that requirement. Generally speaking, I don't enjoy reused areas, but the Northern Undead Asylum is an exception to that. I think it's a genius addition to the game. Going back to that area brought back the memories of what the start of this journey felt like. Unknown hallways became familiar. There was a unique alchemy to the process, transforming a hostile, terrifying labyrinth into a familiar, comfortable challenge. It mirrored how I felt about Souls games in general. The boss fight here, the Stray Demon, was an advanced version of the tutorial boss, the Asylum Demon. Once I defeated him, I had my necessary item to enter the painted world. It's funny to me that when playing Souls games backwards, so much of Dark Souls feels like a dead ringer for later games, except it's the other way around. The painted world of Ariamis felt exactly like painted world of Ariandel in Dark Souls 3, from aesthetics to layouts. The area is a very small level, with the center of it being an open courtyard that unlocks shortcuts to various access points throughout the level. The aesthetics is a big departure from the rest of the game, which emphasized the painted world aspect of this realm for me. For the most part, enemies here are fairly simple. Torch hollows, toxic exploding hollows, wheel guys, and some flying corvians that are not tanky but dish out a lot of damage in very aggressive manners. One unique feature of the painted world is that its bonfire here is cut off from the rest. In order to exit this area, I had to actually find a way to manually walk out of it. This was an absolute genius design touch, as the whole lore of the painted world indicates this was supposed to be a secluded area to trap threats to Lordran. Every corner I traversed had me looking over my shoulder, with the paranoid sense that I might be trapped here for longer than I intended, with no means of escape other than my own wits. At the end of this area, I was faced with Crossbreed Priscilla, a half-dragon boss, the only boss in the game that is non-hostile upon contact. This was a moment of pause for me, as when I walked through the signature white fog, Priscilla was simply standing there, waiting. I felt a strange comfort speaking with her, as she told me that if I wanted to leave, I could just walk past her and leave her and her kind in peace. In a truly hostile place in Lordran, this small bit of mercy gave me a sense of kinship for once. From a gameplay perspective, I found this to be a really considerate aspect, as this is one of the few areas in the game that can truly softlock you if you're stomped on the boss. It's nice to feel that you have a choice around it. If you do choose to fight it and have a hard time beating the boss, well, it was your choice to fight and now you gotta stick to your guns and suffer the consequences, so to speak. At least that's how I interpret it. This time, the area boss that I had to fight wasn't an in-game enemy. It was my own intrusive thoughts. Armed with a fleeting taste of mercy and friendship, I slayed those intrusive thoughts for once and avoided combat. I decided to leave Priscilla alone and took the plunge into the void that brought me back to Anor Londo. With the painted world behind me, I now had no more tasks to complete in Anor Londo. I took my newly obtained Lord Vessel back to the Firelink shrine to rest and regroup to figure out what to do next. When I returned to the shrine, a new NPC emerged, the primordial servant Kingseeker Frampt. He relayed to me my next objective, to gather up the 4 Lord Souls, feed them to the Lord Vessel in order to proceed. He teleported me to the Firelink altar just beneath the shrine to offer up my Lord Vessel. I now had a new objective, to gather up 4 Lord Souls. Before I proceeded with the mainline objective, however, I remembered the basement area past Andre's bonfire. I didn't want to miss out on optional area content, so I headed back to the Undead Parish to see what was hiding there. Underneath Andre's workshop, I entered the Darkroot Garden. Upon first visit, I found the paths in Darkroot Garden to be quite confusing. Moving tree stump enemies and broad open forests disoriented me as I moved through them, looking for the next place to go. I ended up on a route to an open forest, and don't ask me how, I kind of just ended up there and assumed I was progressing when I found a giant staircase. That staircase led up to a boss arena containing the Moonlight Butterfly. Mechanically speaking, the Moonlight Butterfly was rather repetitive in its attack patterns. Once I learned the basic moves it had, the fight turned into a rinse and repeat of dodging at regular times and poking in between. For me, the real highlight of this fight was the atmosphere and music. I think to this day, the soundtrack of the Moonlight Butterfly fight is still my favorite of all Soulsborne bosses. It's the same track used in the Gwendolyn fight, but it doesn't feel that way. I was amazed at how the different contexts changed the way the music sounded to me. For Gwendolyn, the harrowing melody mirrors the infinite hallways and the darkness of an abandoned Anor Londo. For the butterfly, this melody echoes the grace and lightness of the butterfly's movement, its isolation and purity. I loved the atmosphere of the fight so much that I actually found myself wishing it lasted longer. I was probably highly over-leveled for it as the butterfly died in just a few hits. After defeating the area boss, I assumed there was nothing left here for me. I turned out to be wrong about that, as we'll see much later on. For now, I assumed the last optional area in this half was complete. I was ready to return to the main path and begin my quest for the 4 Lord Souls. Structurally speaking, Dark Souls is divided into 2 parts. The first is the quest to ring the Bells of Awakening, and the second half is the quest to gather up the 4 Lord Souls. When I first played the game, I thought my journey would end at Anor Londo. It's what comes after you fulfill the prophecy by ringing the 2 bells. Its enormous scale and sudden departure from the other areas gave me the impression that I hit the endgame somehow. I think my brain had assumed Dark Souls would be similar in format to Elden Ring. In Elden Ring, the endgame is marked by a sudden teleportation to a grand arena, followed by a closely tied sequence of bosses and areas until the endgame. When I saw Anor Londo, I had assumed that the same thing would happen here. In reality, Anor Londo is not a final destination, it's a choke point. All the paths you can take from the start of the game converge at Anor Londo. It's the wall that divides the first half of the game from the second half. The revelation of a whole new act to the game was a welcome surprise for me. As for what I chose to do next, well, the 4 Lord Souls can be obtained in any order, so I chose to go for the one which led to the new Londo Ruins, tackling the ghosts I had stumbled upon at the start of the game. As soon as I stepped out of the elevator from the Firelink shrine to the new Londo Ruins, the dark atmosphere immediately suffocated me. I remembered from the start of the game that the ghost enemies here were intangible to me, so my first order of priority was to find a way to counteract this disadvantage. When I looted a brand new item called the Transient Curse off of a corpse at the entrance, I realized that this might be what was needed for me to finally be able to hurt the ghosts. Item description reads, "Temporary curse allows engagement with ghosts." Here we go, I was ready to trek onto the darkness. In terms of the Transient Curse item, I go back and forth on how I feel about this mechanic. On one hand, I think this unique mechanic sets itself apart very clearly from the rest of the game. The resource management adds a new dimension to the gameplay. If I didn't progress fast enough, I risked running out of the consumable and having to either buy or farm for more. On the other hand, it felt counterintuitive to the slow and methodical approach that had helped me in this game up until now. I was constantly worried that I was going to run out of the curses, so I would try and run past enemies when I could. I fear I might have missed quite a bit of enemy encounters because of this sense of urgency. It also didn't help that the ghosts could phase through walls and had a tendency to cluster together and pursue me relentlessly as a group. This aggression, coupled with my navigational issues, resulted in me frustratingly dying for quite a few times. Eventually, I made my way onto a rooftop and found an NPC named Ingord. When I spoke to him, he said he knew that my intentions were to seek the four kings who reside in the deepest chamber of the ruins. He gave me a key to the seal that opened the floodgates, and told me that in order to traverse the abyss where the four kings are, I would need to find Knight Artorias and learn from him. I took note of what he said and continued on in the area. A few minutes after I spoke to Ingord, I found the lever to open the floodgates. A cutscene appeared. As the floodgates opened and the water that covered the floor of the base of Londo Ruins poured out, a whole other half of the lower level revealed itself. It felt genius that the previously seemingly pointless platforms and paths that led nowhere now all of a sudden made sense because the newly revealed levels completed them. With the new paths available to me, I continued on, encountering the Dark Wraiths for the first time. This new enemy quickly became one of my favorites in the game. They are humanoids similar to the Silver Knights, complete with telegraphed and parryable moves, an invisible shield, and a grab attack. I loved backstabbing and practicing my parries with them, as fighting these enemies felt like there was a somewhat predictable rhythm to the fight, and it provided just a tad bit more familiarity in the otherwise extremely foreign environment. It wasn't all smooth sailing though. While I loved the floodgate mechanic and new enemies, the area was also extremely dark and difficult to navigate. I just kept walking, hoping I would progress, but unable to actually remember or recognize my paths. This state of confusion continued on until I died to a dark wraith, much further into the path. I dreaded having to backtrack again and came close to crashing out at the death screen. This time though, in the few frames before the game faded to black, I saw a glowing gate in the corner of my eye. I recognized this as the same gate I saw in the Valley of Drakes, meaning I now had access to this area from a prior hub. This was a nice consolation prize to my agonizing quest. After I died, I felt pretty exhausted. I still needed to explore the lower half of Londo Ruins, but my frustration was building to a boiling point. I figured it was a good time to take a break from this section. A trusted friend from my server reminded me that I still needed to visit Artorias, so to speak, in order to learn to traverse the abyss. He reminded me that I could go back and buy the crest of Artorias from Andre to unlock the area for Sif. So for a hefty amount of 20,000 souls, I purchased the crest of Artorias and unlocked the previously sealed, glowing gate in the Darkroot Garden. Upon entrance, I immediately noticed that the enemies here were NPC humanoids, each with a unique weapon and moveset. I fought my way through a few of them before seeing a small cat on a windowsill. I spoke to the cat, who offered for me to join her covenant. I agreed out of curiosity, and suddenly all of the NPCs became non-hostile. With that pressure off my shoulders, I progressed onwards towards a narrow bridge and path that followed. That path put me on a one-way trip to the boss arena, where the great wolf Sif was waiting for me. As the name implies, this boss is literally a gigantic wolf with a sword in its mouth. The infamous Great Wolf Sif. Despite Sif being a monster creature style boss, it had relatively simple and predictable movesets. I usually have a harder time reading the telegraphs of non-humanoid entities, so I didn't expect dodging to come so easily to me. Maybe it had to do with the nature of his weapon? In any case, the extra headspace I had during the fight got me pondering at the significance of the Great Wolf. I realized that the whole fight was about Sif trying to hold the line here for his friend and master, Artorias. It gave me a deep respect and a little bit of pain throughout the fight. At low health, I noticed Sif start to whimper and slow down his movements. I felt empathy for Sif, and that drove me to cherish these moments I had with him, even though he was trying to kill me. Eventually, I defeated Sif. He dropped the Covenant of Artorias ring, and this item would allow me to traverse the abyss that led to the Four Kings back in Londo Ruins. With this win under my belt, I felt sufficiently refreshed, with enough mental bandwidth to take on the new Londo Ruins again. I headed back and took my time to explore the lower levels I had unlocked earlier with the floodgates. My exploration put me on the path to the infamous Abyss, where the Four Kings boss awaited me. Entry into the Abyss came in the form of a literal leap of faith, diving into it from a staircase that led to nowhere. When I landed in the Abyss, it showed me just what true darkness looked like. Complete, total pitch blackness. Other than my own character, I had no visibility to anything else. In addition to creating a terrifying atmosphere, it also created a brand new, equally horrifying effect. I now had no depth perception. When the Four Kings Wraith showed up, I had no way of accurately telling where it was located. My only clues were comparing my own size to the Four Kings to try and guess at how close or far I was. The boss was always just a little bit farther than I thought, leaving me constantly calculating attack distances. This trick of depth perception makes this fight 100 times more interesting, as it is otherwise a very simple DPS check fight. Kill each boss before the next one spawns. My solution to the problem was simple but effective. It was a trick I'd actually used before in Elden Ring against a certain Serpentine boss. I ran directly into the boss until I physically could not move any further, and threw my entire arsenal at it. There was no artful parrying or dodging to be seen here. It was just a straightforward case of hit it until it dies and pray you don't die first. Fortunately, this barbarian tackle strat worked great. I quickly beat the boss after committing to this approach. With the Four Kings down, I now officially gathered my first of the 4 Lord Souls needed for the final boss. Next up, I decided to move on to the Duke's Archives, accessed by passing through the initial area of Anor Londo. Once again, my retroactive journey through the Souls games teaches me about the history of these games. The Grand Archives in Dark Souls 3 seems to have taken clear inspiration from earlier work done in the Duke's Archives. I fought my way through the crystallized archers and channelers, eventually taking an elevator up to the top floor of the archives. It was here that I encountered Seath the Scaleless for the first time. I spent the first 20 seconds of this boss fight searching for accessible points to hit this larger-than-life dragon, but I couldn't actually get close enough to hit him. As the "You died" text hit the screen, it filled me with anger. It felt like there was no way I could have prevented my death since Seath was inaccessible from my vantage point and I had no projectiles. The game faded into a black screen, and a second later, I awoke in a jail cell in a tower. I then realized that this was a scripted death encounter, which took a little bit of the edge off my frustration. The door to the cell was locked shut. I noticed a man-serpent guarding the cell door and dozing off. It immediately clicked with me that I could kill him to get the key and free myself. When I walked out of my cell, a cutscene appeared. Another man-serpent noticed my absence from the cell, released a room full of tentacled creatures known as Pasakas from confinement. These creatures ascended the stairs from the bottom of the tower structure to chase me. I got caught shortly after and died to their grab attack. Unfortunately, here I experienced the game's bug, where if I die once, these Pasakas would simply not aggro at all when I respawn, leaving them completely defenseless. I missed out on the experience of fighting them. It was a really great idea, I just wasn't able to see it through. After slaughtering the defenseless squid things, I explored the rest of the prison tower, eventually finding a key that allowed me to exit the tower. Once I was free, I traversed through the rest of the archives, resting at a bonfire that connected the indoor section of the archives to the adjacent outdoor area. I then left the archives, passing through the greenery just outside to arrive at the Crystal Cave. The Crystal Cave itself has a beautiful and unique visual identity, but it stretches on just a bit too long to my liking. The hidden pathways here feel like the conception of the invisible path that later grew into the invisible bridge in Anor Londo in DS3 and the invisible bridge to a mage tower in Elden Ring. It took me a while to find the pathway forward, and I was extremely careful not to fall into the void. The correct path to the boss arena was in fact an invisible bridge. I ran across the bridge, arriving at a rematch with Seath the Scaleless. The rematch encounter with Seath is painfully simple. Now, I never thought the bosses in Dark Souls 1 were particularly complex, but they were always set in beautiful atmosphere. I could always appreciate the design and aesthetics of the bosses while fighting them. In Seath's case, his design didn't matter because I literally could not see him. In order for me to safely hit him, I needed to stay in between Seath's tails towards the back, with my camera locked off to avoid getting caught by his tail's collision boxes. As a result, I spent the entire fight staring at his tail without ever really seeing him. I didn't really get to enjoy much of the boss because of this, but I suppose I'd struggle to call it a waste of time. The combat was straightforward and not too frustrating, so it ended quickly enough. I had no remarkable feelings, and just went about killing him and collecting my second Lord Soul. Before I moved on to the next Lord Soul, I looked up online to see if I had missed any optional areas. That's when I found out about the Great Hollow and Ash Lake, the entrance tucked away behind an illusory wall down in Blighttown. I'm truly glad I found this place because Ash Lake might be the single most impactful area of the entire game for me. See, Dark Souls is generally a very quiet game. Other than the sound of walking, weapon attacks, and ominous enemy breathing, there is no background music in most areas. But Ash Lake is different. The moment I stepped foot out from the tree branches of the Great Hollow, I was greeted by a solemn chorus. That chorus became the backdrop to one of the most breathtaking scenes in all of Dark Souls. I think my feeling in this moment is the dictionary definition of awestruck. I became frozen in place by the sheer majesty of it all, from the trees sprouting across the endless horizon and the quiet aquamarine that washed my entire screen, to the true emptiness that filled the space. In terms of interactivity, there's not much here, save for a combat encounter with a Hydra and a Dragon Covenant at the very end of a narrow beach walkway. That didn't matter to me though. To me, the significance of Ash Lake had nothing to do with what it contained. My arrival to the area was the reward itself. In order to arrive at the Ash Lake, I had to traverse a maze of descending branches, dying over and over again to reach a destination I knew nothing about. That journey of narrow walkways, tight platforms, and constant risk of death kept building up the tension higher and higher, making me wonder if it would even be worth all the stress in the end. Then, at the end of it all, that suffocating, focused intensity is released into a grand, breathtaking view which is so vast and open that my brain struggles to comprehend it. It was a sigh of relief, and the climax of the summit fused into one moment. I think no matter how much I praise this area or try to describe in excruciating detail just how much this place means to me, it really is something you must see for yourself to understand. No words can accurately describe the deep awe and respect it inspires. After experiencing the majesty that was Ash Lake, it was time for me to pick up my quest for the next Lord Soul. Unfortunately, I picked the worst one. Contrary to how majestic and awe-inspiring Ash Lake was, Demon Ruins could only be described as a hellhole, quite literally. I had previously gotten a peek at Demon Ruins when I rang the second bell of awakening in Queellagg's domain, as the entrance to Demon Ruins is just a bit past the bell tower. When I walked past the bonfire and saw the scorching red of the lava pit, I just knew I would have a miserable time here. The first boss I encountered, if you could even call it that, was Ceaseless Discharge. I think the idea behind this boss is very interesting, as the whole point of fighting him is so that he can drain the lava out of the area, making it traversable. Similar to how New Londo Ruins revealed a whole lower level after the drainage. But wow, this fight was so boring. I dodged once, wailed on his resting tentacle, rinsed and repeat 3 times, and then it was over. New Londo Ruins' drainage was interesting because you had to traverse the entire area in agony first to just realize how inconvenient the flood was. You had to work your way through the difficulty, push the lever after all that effort, and relish the convenience of your efforts afterwards. It felt worth it. Here, with Ceaseless Discharge, it felt like the game was just like, well, look at this cool idea. And then it was over. I didn't even really feel like there was much difference in my actual experience in the area. And of course, the infamous copy-pasted lines of Capra demons and Taurus demons. Now, I suppose there's an argument somewhere about how this is lore accurate, as the Demon Ruins is literally where demons spawn, but come on, they look so goofy from a distance, identical enemy models just dancing up adjacent to each other. I think this really broke me out of the game's immersion. I had always heard about how this whole area, the Demon Ruins, then Lost Izalith, felt rushed from a game development perspective. Now that I had experienced it myself, I understood wholeheartedly what it meant. Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith sound like 2 separate areas, but in reality, they have identical aesthetics, environmental hazard, and copy-pasted enemy placement. For an endgame area, the monotony was disappointing. Now, I could tell you about the Demon Fire Sage and the Centipede Demon. I fought them on my way to the area boss of Lost Izalith. But in truth, there's not much to see here. The Demon Fire Sage was the same boss model as the Asylum Demon and the Stray Demon. This would be the 3rd time I am encountering this boss. The Centipede Demon was again a boss I had actually fought in Night Rain, and the re-encounter here was not too noteworthy for me personally. Other than these 2 bosses, the Lost Izalith was pretty much just a straight line to what I consider to be possibly the worst boss of all Souls games, Bed of Chaos. I'm generally a very mild-tempered gamer, and not much frustrates me about video games. I always felt like I could just try again, but the rage I felt fighting the Bed of Chaos reached incomprehensible levels. If you never had the misfortune of fighting the Bed of Chaos, it is just a gimmick boss that involves you having to chop off these 2 glowing orbs on either side of the boss. These 2 weak points are what gives the boss invulnerability, similar to the life crystal Seath the Scaleless has. After the 2 weak points are destroyed, the boss would then be easily defeated by tapping the core chaos bug at the very center of the creature. Now, I didn't mind that it was a gimmick boss. A lot of the Dark Souls bosses were, but this boss felt like complete RNG. Getting the first weak point down was easy for me, as the boss was pretty much non-hostile until I broke the first one, but from here on, it was hours of agony trying to break the second weak point. In other boss fights, every attempt is an opportunity to learn. Boss attacks rarely one-shotted me, so even if I was defeated, I got to see more and more of the boss movesets each time in order to improve my tactics. With the Bed of Chaos, however, so many of her moves involved swiping me with her tree limbs. Her attacks were not only hitboxes, but also collision boxes, which meant that each swipe was sending me through the broken floor and into the void. With every subsequent death, I gained only frustration without even an ounce of knowledge. After I broke the second weak point, it was time for me to go for the Chaos Bug in the center. Similar to the Capra Demon fight at the Undead Burg, my win or loss at hitting the bug was pretty much determined about 5 seconds into the fight. Here's a very quick overview of how that went. After falling through the floor for what feels like infinity, I finally beat the Bed of Chaos, another Lord Soul obtained. I promise I like this game. As I'm writing this script, I notice that I have fewer and fewer things to say about these later areas. I believe a large reason why is the simplicity of level design and somewhat monotonous aesthetics. Don't get me wrong, simplicity in level design is not innately a bad thing. The nuance here, however, is that most of the earlier areas has elements of interconnected design that allows an area to feel dense. Shortcuts you open to earlier locations, like the elevator from Undead Parish to the Firelink Shrine, hub areas that connect multiple nexus points like the Valley of Drakes. These details make the world feel alive, and these game levels feel like they have a purpose in relation to the rest of the game world. The same cannot be said for the linear areas in the second half of the game, like the Catacombs. The Catacombs has some interesting mechanics in isolation, such as the Necromancer and their infinitely regenerating skeletons, rotating handles and walkways, maze-like platforming. But the problem, as I see it, is that the level did not give me any time to sit with the designs. It's a straight path to the exit. Even after traversing it twice on my 2 playthroughs, there isn't a singular memorable moment in the Catacombs. All I really remember is the infinite annoyance of getting ganked on by skeletons everywhere I go, and the pinwheel boss that I was way too overleveled for that I killed in 5 hits. It was all over and done very quickly. Once I moved past the Catacombs, I arrived at the Tomb of Giants for my last Lord Soul. I'm going to save you a large number of minutes on the Tomb of Giants, because I can sum up my entire experience here in one phrase. I can't see. That's literally it. Every area in Dark Souls thus far has distinctive visual identities, and most of them are very interesting to look at, save for Demon Ruins and the Lost Izalith, where the texture starts to be monotonous. But here in the Tomb of Giants, there is nothing to see. The entire area's gimmick and difficulty lies in the lack of visibility. I died a lot. To gravity, giant skeletons, giant skeleton dogs, some random NPCs, more gravity, and somehow I ended up in Gravelord Nito's arena. I was fortunate enough to make it to the area boss, but if you ask me for directions, I would still have zero idea on how I got here. Nito was the last Lord Soul I needed in order to unlock the final boss, and I honestly could not wait to get him over with. Nito's fight was primarily a gank fight. He summons respawning skeletons that try to stunlock and wail on me in a corner. The trick to this boss, however, is a divine weapon that can permakill these skeletons, similar to the holy weapons and the undead in later games. I brought with me a divine weapon and prioritized killing the skeleton minions first, and once they were all dead, Nito was practically left defenseless. With Nito dead, all Lord Souls were collected. With all souls fed to the Lord Vessel, I opened the door to the Kiln of the First Flame, where Gwyn resides. Before I moved on to Gwyn, the final boss, I wanted to tackle the DLC. It fascinates me how the first gamers found the way to unlock the DLC upon release before any published guides. I didn't even bother trying to figure it out on my own, as I had no clue where to even start. I looked up a guide and learned that the road to access the DLC is a multi-step process that involved me going to different places. I first had to kill the Hydra in Darkroot Basin, and circle around to the back of the lake. I then had to fight a gold iron golem there, then talk to the NPC, Dusk of Oolacile, who is freed from the golem. Then go back to Duke's archives and kill another random golem who looked like he was deep in thought to retrieve the item. Come back to where Dusk was and access the DLC through a black hole that is now there. Yeah, I genuinely do not know how you would figure this out, but then again, there are many things I would likely miss if not for all the guides people have written. I followed the guide religiously and eventually made my way to the black hole in Darkroot Basin that teleported me to the DLC area. The Dark Souls DLC, Artorias of the Abyss, was released a year after the base game. The overall style of the DLC bosses is definitely a step up in complexity. Unfortunately, the overall level designs of this DLC fell flat for me, as many of the areas were just flat open spaces with enemies sprinkled around choke points. Upon entry to the DLC, I was faced with the Sanctuary Guardian. As the name indicated, this boss was my first obstacle to this DLC and a skill check. Compared to the base game animal-style combat such as Sif, the Sanctuary Guardian has a lot more variance in its attacks, and the integration of lightning in his attacks makes for an interesting factor to account for in this fight. Once I defeated him, I was in Oolacile, the proper entry to the DLC. The entire first section of the Royal Wood led up to Artorias. This area looked like a vast, intricate level at first, especially because the forest stretches on in all directions, making it easy to get lost in. However, once I learned the actual route to Artorias, I realized the size of this area was nothing but an illusion. It was a straight path from start to finish, and all the distance in between was just a really long boss run back, even with the shortcut unlocked. The fight of Artorias itself was enjoyable. I love guy in armor fights, and Artorias has got to be the epitome of all guys in armor fights. But the fight itself didn't fix my overall disappointment with the area. Personally, I care deeply about level design even more than I care about boss designs. Without a proper build-up, the climax simply fell flat for me. Thankfully, once I beat Artorias, I proceeded to Oolacile Township. Here, the area came alive for me. The resident enemies here have insect-like heads, manic movements, and their laughter sound like something from an insane asylum. The entire area has that maddening atmosphere, and I was in fact disturbed. Small tangent. Here I encountered a mimic chest that made me giggle. I walked up to this unassuming chest by the end of a bridge. Maybe it was because I hadn't seen a mimic chest in a while, I let my guard down. It ate me the first time, and when I came back and killed the mimic, it spat out a very good carving. I had a good laugh at this. Following the narrow pathways, I found an indoor structure. Inside, I found many horrifying residents. Their creepy eyes glowing in the dark, their breathing humming in the air. I got the EBGBs for sure. Continuing on past the structure and through a fort eroded by the abyss, I eventually took an elevator down to the abyss. The abyss was exactly as it sounds, a dark and haunting space filled with residents, as well as humanities. It's interesting to see that the item I had been consuming all game long were actually living beings that floated ominously in space. I stumbled around in the dark, eventually arriving at the door to the area boss, Manus. Manus was most definitely the hardest boss in the game for me. He hits really hard, and I could barely make a dent in his health bar. I also struggled with the camera quite a bit here. The arena was dark, as was Manus himself. He blended into the background, and I struggled to see him and his goo-filled arm. I just kept dying over and over to his attacks. Eventually, I lost motivation to fight him. I knew that with my skill level, I was going to have to learn his moves for probably a few hours. And since he was the end of the DLC, I gave up on fighting him altogether. I wasn't enjoying the fight, and it wasn't required content. For once, a boss had managed to defeat me. I allowed him that victory and left the DLC area, returning back to the main quest and towards the final destination of the game, the Kiln of the First Flame. Now that I had seen all of the DLC content, it was time for me to face Gwyn, the final boss of Dark Souls. Access to Gwyn was unlocked the moment I offered up the 4 Lord Souls. The door behind the Lord Vessel opened, giving entry to the Kiln of the First Flame. This was a harrowingly beautiful space. Filled with ash and silver knights, the road to Gwyn's boss arena was long and quiet. It gave me plenty of time to sit in my thoughts and feelings of playing Dark Souls, a meditative moment of reflection before the end. Looking back on this journey, there were moments of sorrow, defeat, and prideful triumph. But one prominent sentiment overshadows the rest: endless perseverance. It was with this feeling of perseverance that I faced Gwyn. As the iconic beats played, I trivialized the boss fight with parries. Gwyn's fight was astonishingly simple, but I was fully immersed in the peaceful and rhythmic combat. The long journey had come to its conclusion at last. Within a minute, Gwyn fell to my sword. Once the dust had settled, no pun intended, I walked up to an unlit bonfire in the boss arena. A prompt popped up, "Link the flame," and that was exactly what I did. The moment the kindling flickered, a cutscene appeared. From the center of the bonfire, the flames slowly crept up my arms and torso until I was fully engulfed in it. From my body, the flames sprawled out in all directions, devouring the entire arena. My screen faded to black. The credits began to roll. As the chorus of the background music started to sing, I thought about what I had just done. I linked the flame, just as Gwyn did. I became a vessel for the flame that will continue to light the world. It was what I set out to do from the very beginning, or at least that was the path I had taken. But somehow, I was left with a strange, deep sadness. I saved the world, but in the process, I became the next Gwyn. Someday, my flame will die out, and someone will have to come in my stead, slaying me as I did to my own predecessor. Knowing the fate of the flame from Dark Souls 3, it does seem like that doomed future was exactly what happened after. I didn't change anything. I only extended the path to a predetermined outcome. The destination remained identical all the same. Were my efforts worth it? I could not help but ask myself. What is the point if all this effort amounted to was the status quo? I cannot answer for others, only myself. The answer I've come to was this. My journey was for me, not for the world. I died over and over, but I persisted. I tried time and time again, and I succeeded. I grew to love the hostile world, to feel the kinship with its people, to fight for the little agency we had. I gave all I had to give, and that's enough. Now that I have completed 2 playthroughs, including the one I played to capture footage for this video, here are my honest thoughts. Dark Souls is clearly an old game. Compared to modern titles like Elden Ring, movement feels janky. There's no other way to say it. However, it didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. There isn't a single moment where your base reflex is what determines life or death. In fact, the game punishes impulsive action. Running past enemies results in death. Panic healing results in death. Charging head-on into an unknown territory results in death. Every uncalculated decision results in death. The game encourages you to slow down, to make smart choices rather than rely on your reflexes. It pushes you to contemplate your decisions and embrace every encounter as a puzzle to solve. Combat is slow and steady. I didn't have any flashy weapon arts or over-the-top spectacle. My movements were exactly what a normal human could do. I didn't have a magical win button, just me and the metal. The boss fights were straightforward. They didn't seem to have any multi-phase transformations or dazzling movesets. Most consisted of a handful of moves to get used to, then simply rinse and repeat the right patterns until the bosses die. In other Souls titles, bosses often feel like an overwhelming rush of sound, light, size, and an endless gauntlet of combos. In Dark Souls though, I didn't feel panic or adrenaline exploding out of me at the boss. What I did feel was peace. It sounds odd to use that word, especially in a game so famous for difficulty it has a prepare to die edition. But it's the best way to describe my experience. These bosses move at a predictable and steady pace, giving ample space for a timed response. This rhythm turned these fights into a coordinated dance between me and the boss, like a kind of meditation. Even against tragic enemies like Sif, Artorias, and Gwyn, these dances felt like quiet struggles, not desperate warfare. On this note, I also want to share a somewhat controversial opinion. On their own, the boss fights really don't matter that much to me. For a lot of people I have talked to, boss fights are the highlights of their Souls game experiences. They often speak with enthusiasm of a boss that excited them and challenged them in unique ways. Some even call the bosses the entire point of the game. As I said before, I enjoyed my time with the bosses. My opinion has nothing to do with their design, but rather what purpose they actually serve. For me, the allure of boss fights usually rests in that first exposure, when I see what the bosses can do and what environment they're set in. Every subsequent rematch degrades the immersion for me. The narrative, the atmosphere, and the design start to melt away into moving data points, blocking me from progress. I see hitboxes and damage numbers instead of characters. I hear attack signals and dodge rolls, not music. Victory no longer feels like the summit of a mountain, it's the exhausting end to a mechanical chore. For me, Dark Souls bosses feel best as a climax to the area. They leave me with enough mental space to contemplate my journey, examine my place in the world, and reason for being here, all while challenging me to respond to these ideas with action. When all of these come together in combat, it feels like peak fiction. But all of this is dependent on everything that builds up to it. Focusing on just the bosses feels like ripping out the last chapter of a book and calling it the selling point. I feel this even more strongly when I'm flooded with boss rush mods, tier lists, or descriptions of Dark Souls that skip over everything to just talk about the bosses. They feel like compilations of the final 5 minutes of a bunch of movies to me. Without the context of everything that built up to that climax, I feel nothing at all. To be clear, I respect and admire the people who can devote so much passion and attention to these bosses. It's a truly amazing and essential part of the Souls community. My difference of opinion does not equate to disagreement. I'm sharing this view to offer a different perspective to long-term fans of the game and hopefully to make anyone else who shares this opinion feel seen. I felt like a fake Souls fan for quite a while, because I had so much adoration for these games but didn't care as much about the bosses, which seemed to be the highlight for others. The levels that contained the bosses were what I fell in love with, not the specific fights. Making this video helped me put the feelings to words and make peace with it. I love the forest itself, not any one set of trees. That's the best way I can describe it right now. I played the remastered version released in 2018 with updated design and graphics, and even then, the aesthetics of Dark Souls is rusty, and the renderings of the environment can be rough and full of blemishes. But it's exactly these imperfections and rusty deteriorations that perfectly encapsulate the feeling of melancholia. Every staircase, every sewer pipe, every empty hall, and every lava pit all whisper loneliness and aimlessness. No wonder why every NPC you meet warns you against hollowing, the fate of many others who came before you. The oppressive weight of rot and death surrounding you at all times serves to make any reprieve, no matter how small, feel like a magical experience. The contrast between these two states creates tension throughout the game. That strange tension between ambition and futility, life and death, purpose and hopelessness, that is Dark Souls. Once I identified that and put words to it, I finally had an answer to the question I had set out on this whole journey for. The question, does Dark Souls still hold up a decade later, has a very specific meaning for me. My comparison between black and white film versus classical paintings explained it best. What I wanted to know was whether the game was art or artifact. The arguments for it being a historical artifact are obvious. The game has a lot of jank to it. To sit here and enumerate every fault I found would be an enormous task that could easily fill up its own video. I understand why those faults would make someone hesitant to try these games. They are real, and not just a skill issue in my eyes. In spite of all that, I find myself drawn to a different conclusion. If you're someone who is hesitant to play Dark Souls because of these faults, like I was, then I'd like to tell you something. Dark Souls is a feeling. It's a game that requires patience, curiosity, and engagement to fully appreciate. It cannot be judged by one-dimensional factors like aesthetics, game controls, or even boss designs. Because even though any one factor might have hundreds of insufficiencies, we as players don't experience each factor in isolation. Just like how we don't experience a song as individual instruments or notes. Dark Souls is a symphony, using the features of the game as pieces of its orchestra. It uses isolation, frustration, exasperation, and despair as its musical notes. But it also uses inspiration, hope, and perseverance. The final result is a journey through all of those experiences and how ultimately they're deeply intertwined. It's a sensation so deep and complex that I can only describe the final result as a specific feeling. Dark Souls is that feeling. However, playing a game isn't as easy as listening to music. It requires a tremendous leap of faith that I almost didn't take for the same reasons as many others. If it wasn't for my community, I might not have seen it through to the end, and I would have been worse off for it. So if you're looking for a reason to have faith and take the plunge into this infamous title, then let this be your sign. Yes, Dark Souls is janky, but it's worth it. Thank you for coming on this long journey with me. This was my first time attempting a project of this scale, as my previous videos weren't even a quarter of this length. I also appreciate the patience from my Patreon's community who has been waiting on this release for months. If you want to know more about my production process, what's coming down the pipeline, and help me create these videos, I'd recommend taking a look at the Patreon and see if it's for you. It's been a valuable place for me to share ongoing thoughts, exclusive writing and director's notes, as well as poll you guys for what to try next. It helps to get these videos out faster as well, since it gives me an important creative outlet during the deep editing cycles, so I truly appreciate the support. Also, you get a cute little tag in our Discord. Speaking of which, we also have a community Discord for playing games, hanging out, discussing upcoming releases, and other shenanigans. Consider joining to stop by, chat about games, play a few runs, or just lurk in the channels for as little or as long as you like. We're just happy to have you here. I said it at the start and I'll say it again here, this video was a leap of faith for me that would not have gotten made without the support of my patrons and the community. So in case I haven't said it enough to you guys already, thank you so much. I can't promise the next video will come by any faster, but I can promise that a new bonfire will be lit again, a new journey with new thoughts to share, and a new challenge to take on together. So don't give up, skeleton, and until next time, bye.